President Trump continues to make progress towards talking with Zelensky, with Vladimir Putin to try and get the Russia-Ukraine war to a terminated situation as soon as possible. We actually have this breaking news here just 20 minutes ago. Volodymyr Zelensky says, let's do a deal offering Trump mineral partnership seeking security. We'll see how that works out in just a second. But we are very fortunate today to have one of the show's really good friends, and I'm considering more and more just a friend of mine, Alexander Mercouris, coming to us from London, co-host of the Duran show, and just all-around great guy.
Well, thank you very much, Daniel, and it's always a huge pleasure to come onto this show. And can I just say, I'm delighted that we are friends, just to say.
As am I, and look forward to actually meeting with you and your lovely wife again whenever we have a chance soon.
Absolutely.
But first, we have to take care of business. And we're going to have today a combination of some things that might be plausible. There could be, as you were saying before we came on the air today, some method to some of the madness. But then there's also, unfortunately, just some madness without method. And that's going to be a problem when you're going to try to make all this have some kind of a good conclusion. But let's just jump right into it. So you saw there that Zelensky is telling Trump publicly, let's make a deal. And by the way, we can include some mineral partnerships on that. Now, it's really important to see, and I haven't had a chance to read the article yet, but what he means by do a deal, what kind of deal is he talking about? We'll see if it's the same kind of deal that Trump is. But here's what Trump said just hours ago.
One of the things we're looking at with President Zelensky is having the security of their assets. They have assets underground, rare earth and other things, but primarily rare earth. And we want to have security. Really, we want security.
And you're speaking with him next week, sir? Is that what he said? You're going to speak.
He may meet next week, yeah. Whenever he'd like. I'm here. I'm here. Could be Washington. Well, I'm not going there.
Are you planning to meet with President Putin, or are you just planning a phone call?
It could be. We've always had a good relationship. President Putin and I have always had a good relationship. That's why it's so sad that it happened. This would have never happened if I were president. It's so sad to see it happen. So many dead people. By the way, so many cities are demolished. They're like, you talk about Gaza? Well, take a look at Ukraine. So many of those cities are demolition sites. Demolished. So sad. Should have never happened. All those beautiful golden domes, but much more importantly, all those beautiful people are dead.
And we're going to talk about some of the specific things that he said there. But at the end of that clip, he says, you talk about Gaza, look at Ukraine. Well, these are some fresh images from the city of Toretsk, which has just fallen to the Russians after many months of attempt. It finally officially fell, at least according to some reports this morning, which I'll show you in just a second. It's fallen. But just, Alexander, I mean, to look at this just devastation, it's just it's hard to believe. I mean, literally, it's just devoid of life, this otherwise fairly large city.
Absolutely. It is shattered. And it was an important city in Donbas. It was a center of an important coal mining area. It's the center of a big urban conurbation. And it was also the suburb of an even bigger industrial city called Gorlovka, which the Russians have controlled since 2014, but which has also apparently been quite badly damaged. So you see this big industrial town. Toretsk had a population before the war of about 35,000. At one time, in the early days of Ukrainian independence, it had been around 50,000, just to say. And it's the center of a conurbation of a cluster of villages and smaller towns. And if you looked at the entire area, it was about 80,000 people. And well, you could see what it's become. It's a shattered landscape.
Yeah, this is, I'm showing on the map here. This is Toretsk right here in the middle. And you can see the military summary channel this morning is reporting that now the entire city has been taken. Even the one of the last holdouts was right here in the northern part. That appears to be gone. And then here's some of the larger conglomerations you're talking about with Relivka, et cetera. And then, there's they're getting to the end of, there's still some fortification lines right here, but you see that beyond that, it gets a little bit more sparse. But as we're going to see later on, it's not even just a matter of the fortifications themselves, but of the men to man the fortifications.
This is absolutely right. I mean, Toretsk was one of the major fortified positions that Ukraine relied upon to create, the barrier to Russian advances. It had been built up as a fortified area since the fighting in 2014. I mean, this is where the front line has been for a very, very long time. So in military terms, if you're looking at this strictly from the point of armies, if you put aside the devastation, the human tragedy, I mean, this is a big win for the Russians. I mean, they've broken through one of the most difficult fortified positions, and they're now reaching, if you like, the sort of softer, not fully soft, but softer underbelly of the Ukrainian positions in Donbas. They're inching closer to the big urban conurbation, Slavyansk, Kramatorsk, Konstantinovka, which is the last major urban community left in Donbas, still under Ukrainian control.
And one of the other things that Trump was talking about there, I think it's perhaps telling that Trump is leading off there with talking about the deal that he wants to get with Zelensky, which in Trump terms means financial deal that he wants. He said in a previous conversation that they're looking for basically secure financial guarantees that, the money that we have provided up to this point, that there's going to be a return on investment, et cetera. But what is your understanding about the extractability of that? How much can he actually turn that into money? Because as I understand from talking to some geologists and some financial people, that this stuff has been there forever, obviously, and yet there wasn't a big move to do it before, because apparently it's very difficult, timely, and cost expensive to extract.
Well, this is exactly correct. I mean, if we're talking about some of these rare earths, extracting the rare earths is difficult, and processing them is difficult, and it takes time to set up the facilities, the industrial facilities, and it costs a lot. And I understand, actually, that if you really wanted to do it, you can do it in the United States. I mean, the United States is a huge territory. North America is a huge territory. Apparently, it's not that these things are, geologically rare exactly. It's that extracting them and processing them takes an awful lot. The Chinese invested in doing it. They went about doing it over many, many, many years. So they've got all that sorted out, but it took them a while to get there. Sorting out, getting these facilities organized in Ukraine is going to take a huge amount of time, a huge amount of resources. Is it really worth doing in Ukraine? And bear in mind that apparently a lot of these deposits, some say up to 70% of them, are located on territory which the Russians already control. So you need to negotiate deals with the Ukrainians. It would cost you an awful lot to do. I just don't think this is a practical proposition. It's a tantalizing one. I can see, that Zelensky is floating this in front of Trump. But I think from Zelensky's point of view, this is actually quite dangerous, because he's now changing the narrative in a kind of way. He's not saying any longer, you must support me because I'm a useful ally. I can hold back the Russians for you. I'm protecting Europe. You should support me because, I am the leader of a democracy and Russia isn't. He's now saying, support me, and it's a commercial transaction now. You get money out of it. And if, of course, Ukraine can't give that money, if it can't give the resources, then, of course, it's a losing proposition. And I wonder whether Zelensky really has thought it through fully. I can tell you for a fact he hasn't, by the way.
Right. I think that's pretty self-evident. One of the other things that Zelensky, at least I perceive that it's easy for him to make that offer, because he also knows that it would take literally years after the war is over, after all the violence has come to a complete end, to even get to the point to where this stuff's coming out. So I think that's something way down the line that he's like, I don't really care about that anyway, but if I can get something from Trump up front, then that's a big win for him right now, because he seems very transactional as well.
Exactly. Well, that's exactly the idea. So, as I said, persuade Trump to give more money and more weapons to Ukraine, keep the war going, promise that eventually you'll pay it back with all of these minerals. I hope, by the way, that Trump, who is no fool, I mean, he's no fool, and he's got plenty of good advisors, won't fall for this one in the end.
He certainly does, and some of them have been on our show before. That so we know that some of them are up there are pretty good, and we're pretty happy about that because it bodes well for what could be coming. I want to shift a little bit now. I said that there was some method to the madness, maybe with Trump, but there's maybe just madness to the method in some of the other parties, especially in Ukraine. I'm going to show you here a clip in a second about what Zelensky is talking about here, but. One of the things he's going to be discussing is the Kursk area, the incursion that they made back on August the 6th of last year, and how it's been shrunk. About 60% of it has been taken out, but they still hold this corridor right here. I'm going to talk to you about that on some military terms in a second. In recent, I guess the last 2 or 3 days, Ukraine has made a couple of local counterattacks into these areas right here and then right here, to especially coming out of Suja. They have retaken just a little bit of territory here. But interesting how Zelensky quantifies this. Watch how he discusses it earlier today.
Всім нашим підрозділам, які задіяні на Курщині, які показали всьому світові, що ми можемо навіть в умовах обмежених ресурсів діяти активно, неочікувано і результативно. Російський блеф виявляємо як блеф.
I said that was today. That was actually yesterday. But what do you make of that? Because he's saying that this shows how decisive we can act because we took this piece of territory. They still can't get it back, and it shows Putin was a bluff. Now, when I saw that, I actually went back to see, well, what's he talking about? What was he talking about? Bluff. And in the context of the video, both before and after, he never mentions it. So he just kind of states it as a statement that I don't know what he means by Putin was bluffing. But what do you make of his comments here about Kursk, and how important do you think it is to the war effort?
Well, I think we've discussed this before, and I in some ways you're probably better at understanding this than I am. But to me, what Kursk has been is a disastrous misuse of resources. Ukraine is now losing key places. We were just talking about Toretsk earlier in the program, the core of an urban conurbation of about 80,000 people, a critically important part of Ukraine's defense lines. Right at the core of Donbas, where the battle is happening, opening the way for attacks on places like Slavyansk and Kramatorsk and those places. And here we have Zelensky still harping on about Kursk, an isolated, poor region of Russia, bad roads, no important urban centers apart from the city of Kursk itself, which is conclusively out of reach. And he continues to send resources and men and machines to fight there, even though the cost of doing so is apparently enormous. And he is leading, or so it seems to me, the Ukrainian army deeper and deeper down a trap, because it's a trap. It's a trap that they've made for themselves. They are sending all these men and all these machines to fight for these little villages. The particular village I think that's been fought over in this offensive is a place called Ruskaya Konopyelka. You would have difficulty finding it on a map, to say it bluntly. It's close to a place called Suja, which is the one town they've captured, which had a pre-war population of 6,000 people. As I said, it leads nowhere. It goes nowhere. It's meaningless, I would have thought, from economic, political, military terms. But it's in pre-2014 Russia. And for Zelensky, this seems to have an almost mystical significance. So he dwells on the fact that, you know, he's capturing a few fields there and an odd tiny village here in Kursk region, even as he loses places like Toretsk, other places threatened as well. His army's falling apart in many parts of Donbas. But look, he's able to say, I've made advances in this little place, in this village. And that proves that Putin is bluffing in some mysterious way that nobody can see.
That apparently that I can't see either. But you know, I've talked to a number of military experts, and Some speculate that, in fact, there is some evidence to corroborate this to a certain degree, anyway, that before the incursion began, that Russians openly and in some Telegram channels were aware of what was coming on and actually didn't take any effort to block them, let them come in, had a blocking position so they could only go a certain length. And then during the rest of that time, they have actually kept the thing open and they have not shut it off. We actually had one of your British fellows yesterday, retired Commodore Steve Jeremy, come on the show yesterday and say he believes that the whole Kursk thing has been kept open intentionally by the Russians because the Ukraine side just continues to flow troop after troop after troop and military equipment and personnel that could be more effective in other places. Because he said, from his perspective, it doesn't seem like it would have been that hard for Russia to close off the neck of that incursion anytime that they wanted to. But by keeping it open, Ukraine keeps diverting men in there that now makes it better on the Eastern Front. What do you think of that?
Well, I think, first of all, that makes absolute sense to me. That's the first thing. And of course, like yourself, Commodore Jeremy is a military person who has written a very fine article, by the way, about the war in responsible statecraft, the website of the Quincy Institute. It's a very intelligent and well-written piece. That's the first thing. But I have actually some personal knowledge here, which I think I've shared with you in a previous program, which is that about 2 months before the Kursk operation, an individual contacted me, somebody I've had regular contact with. I'm afraid I can't disclose who it is, but he told me, and he's got sources, that the Russians were aware that the Ukrainians were planning something in Kursk and discussed it with each other and said, let's let them come. I mean, let's invite them there, because we're going to bring the Ukrainians into a place which is of no great strategic or military significance, and we're going to bleed them. So I got that information 2 months before it happened. I didn't pay any attention because I don't really understand or those kind of things, and it seemed to be very surprising. But then it happened, and the person contacted me again, and he told me, I told you so.
Wow. Okay. Well, see, that puts a little bit more finer edge on people not seeing things the way they are and people being delusionary thinking. And unfortunately, that's going to continue on here because General Keith Kellogg, the Trump's advisor to try to solve the Russia-Ukraine war, met with the Ukrainian ambassador to the United States, Markarovka, here I guess yesterday, maybe it was. And then yesterday on MSNBC, she went on and made a very just puzzling statement. She's going to be talking here in what I'm about to show you about how they think that the war should be ended. And you tell me, does this sound like somebody who's been battered for 3 years of war and has the walls closing in?
They should just stop the aggression, get out from our country. That's the end of the war. So it's really, surprising that they say somebody else has to do something. It's them who have to do something. But Ukraine, of course, will not be a problem there. And President Zelensky has always been ready not only to defend the country, as we all are doing, and he's leading the country in defense, but also saying that we are open to any diplomatic engagements. It's Putin and Russia who started this war. They have to change their intent and they have to want to stop it.
Okay, I get it that you want them to stop it, but to say that Russia, no, we're not going to do anything we don't want to because Russia has to. What do you think when you hear that kind of statement?
Well, it is rhetoric, and it is dangerous rhetoric. I mean, it sounds impressive on a talk show. It can perhaps persuade a few people who are not familiar with the realities. But the realities are that the Ukrainian army is being smashed. The Russians are advancing. They will continue to advance. And saying that, the Russians have to stop, the Russians have to pull out, is unreal. It is not going to happen. And on the one hand, of course, it's good to hear that she says that President Zelensky is prepared to talk. He hasn't always been. He's still got a decree, which he signed on the 2nd of October 2022, which appears to rule out negotiations. But now he says he's going to talk. Well, let him talk, but let him be realistic about this. The Russians are winning the war. I think that everybody who's been following events closely can see that. They're not only winning the war, but they're going to start winning the war more quickly. I mean, the pace of events, especially when the spring thaw comes, is going to start to accelerate. So better face that fact and negotiate on the basis of that reality than start clinging on to these rhetorical points, these talking points, because that's all they are. And negotiate seriously.
Well, now on that point, so
Yeah.
there was, and I can't remember the exact date. I'm not sure. I have to go back and track through comments. But I know that even as of last summer, and certainly the late spring, early summer of 2024, Zelensky was still talking 1991 borders. He was still saying, no, even though everything failed in 2023, and even though Russia was advancing, we're still going to win back to the 1991 borders. Then he kind of went silent on that for a while. And then all of a sudden, out of nowhere, maybe in the middle to late fall of last year, now all of a sudden he's just talking about negotiations. But what I have never heard, and maybe you have, when he says negotiations, what does he think he's going to negotiate away? And how does that line up with the reality on the ground?
Well, I don't think he's really worked out a negotiating plan. I don't think he's capable of doing it, because when he talks about negotiations, basically what he wants is some kind of diplomatic process which will end up giving him exactly the same outcome that he cannot achieve in military terms. So he unveiled a so-called peace plan. This is some time ago, which said, as you correctly said, 1991 borders. He's never actually walked it back. He's never said that's not going to happen. But now he comes up with various thoughts, various ideas, some of them, frankly, irrational. Give us back nuclear weapons. We should have our nuclear weapons given us back to us, which, I mean, Kellogg, in fairness, has said that's an absurd idea. That's not going to happen.
Well, yeah,
give us missiles.
we're going to talk about that in just a second.
Yeah,
but let's look at what's
a person who is talking in this way. He's not really serious about negotiations. Again, he accepts that everybody wants him to negotiate. So he's talking about negotiations, but he's not talking about them in a realistic way.
Well, that could be a problem with Trump coming in looking to have a negotiation in this within 100 days. And apparently, as of earlier today, when I saw some of the comments from the administration, that's still the target. They're still shooting for have it wrapped up been 100 days. There was in fact, it was so-called leaked. We'll see if that was an accidental leak or a so-called trial balloon that they talk about here, where somebody wanted it to be leaked, and they said they wanted a ceasefire by Easter, which I want to say is somewhere in early April. I can't remember the date. A formal deal to end the war shortly thereafter, so that within 100 days the thing's done. Do you think that is possible if it's all contingent upon Zelensky accepting that kind of a deal?
Well, yes, I mean, it is possible. You could perhaps do it within 100 days, but you have to be very clear about what you are going to concede. And you have to understand that Ukraine is losing the war, that the Russians are winning the war. And if you're going to do it in 100 days, you may have to make very much more significant concessions to the Russians than you're perhaps talking about at the moment. Now, the Russians set out their terms that basically back in June last year. It's difficult to see why, if you're going to negotiate with them in 100 days and say that you want it all done in 100 days, why the Russians, given that they're winning the war, would relax their terms. I don't think setting these kind of deadlines, for me, is a good negotiating strategy going forward, because it suggests to the other side that you are very, very anxious to make it.
Right.
And
Right.
that anxious, maybe we can hold out for even more. You are dealing with the Russians Now, I have dealt with Russians in negotiating, I mean, not commercial negotiations, and they are exceptionally tough and meticulous negotiators. And I've heard about the way the Russians conduct negotiations in diplomacy and foreign policy. There are lots of people in the United States you could call upon who can advise about that too, by the way, who had to negotiate them. They are relentless negotiators. They have every single detail at their fingertips, and they will sense weakness. And telling them that you want it all done by May tells them that you're in a hurry, and that's something they can take advantage of.
Well, and let me point out some of the reasons why they can take advantage of that. The Ukraine side is running out of troops. This was in, I believe it's today's Wall Street Journal, where they're talking about that Ukraine is having to try and use technology to go after the Russians. Apparently, a lot of those drones have been even targeting individual Russian infantry because Ukraine doesn't have enough infantry. We've shown on this show over the last couple of weeks commentary by some of the Ukraine troops themselves, how they say they're worn out. If there's not a negotiated settlement, they're not sure that they can even last until the summer as a force, not just individuals. So every way you look, and you talk about the Russians have all the details at their hand, they certainly know this because they see it on the battlefield. They see that they're continuing to advance even through all of this negotiations here. That doesn't seem that it would bode very well for the Ukraine side to try to hold out for a better deal.
Well, that's exactly right. I mean, the Russians know exactly what's going on the battlefields. They are far more informed, far better informed than the Wall Street Journal is, if I can say so, about the actual military balance on the battlefronts. They know how tired the Ukrainians are. They know how short of equipment the Ukrainians are. I mean, the Ukrainians have lots of drones. The Russians, by all accounts, have even more drones, and they're using some very advanced drones now. I mean,
in fact, those scenes that Gary was showing earlier in this episode here were of a significant number of the fiber optic drones that Russia is using. The majority of these videos here are fiber optic drones. You can tell by how clear the image is right at the last point here. Yeah. And these, by all accounts, are starting to increase in volume on the front lines. And so that's just adding to the Ukraine side. So whatever Ukraine's doing with drones, Russia's doing more, it appears.
Well, exactly. They're doing more with drones. They got more artillery, more guns, more tanks, more aircraft. I mean, in terms of aviation, of course, it's not even I mean, there's no equality. So from a Russian point of view, they are under no pressure to move and negotiate fast. And if you come to them with proposals that they're not interested in, and you tell them that you want to do it within 100 days, they will sense your weakness. They will dig in. They know that things are working in their advantage, and they will wait until things move further in their advantage, and then they will take an even stronger line. That is what they will do.
You mentioned this a second ago, but I wonder to what extent the Ukrainian, and that means Zelensky's recognition of these realities, and it would seem that he would at least have the knowledge about what's really going on there. If he's not able to process, it's a separate issue. But perhaps that's what led him to ask for this really strange request that he did on Piers Morgan a couple of days ago.
Will we be given nuclear weapons? Then let them give us nuclear weapons. Will they give us the missiles in the quantities that we can stop Russia? And I'm not sure of that, but I think it would help. Otherwise, what missiles can stop Russia's nuclear missiles? That is a rhetoric question. So let's do it the following way. Give us back nuclear arms. Give us missile systems. Partners, help us finance the 1 million army. Move your contingent on the parts of our state where we want the stability of the situation so that the people have tranquility.
Yes, the people have tranquility. If we get nuclear weapons, is there any scenario on the planet that you would ever say, yeah, let's give Zelensky some nuclear weapons?
Well, of course not. I mean, it's a crazy idea. I mean, it's absurd. The very fact that he's bringing up those kind of ideas at all ought to be telling people like General Kellogg in Washington that this is not someone that you want on your side in a negotiation. He is not he's not being realistic, and I think that's being a very kind word. He's being utterly reckless, and again, listening to all of that, he doesn't come across to me as the sort of person who's prepared to make the kind of concessions that he needs to make in order to achieve peace. Now, if you go back to those Russian demands that they made back in June, now, you know, they're tough. They're very tough. They're not so far impossible. And there might be some scope to negotiate around them. Just saying. I mean, but if you draw this out, if you go on and come up with proposals like that or talk like that, then of course the negotiations aren't going to go anywhere. And the Russians are going to say to themselves, well, let's just continue the war. Zelensky isn't serious. The Americans aren't serious either because they're not controlling him. And we might as just well continue because in 3 months' time, in 6 months' time, we'll be in an even stronger position than the one we're in now.
You know, we titled this episode here, Ukraine's Slow Death March. And I think that you're seeing the contours of that play out, and you're starting to really discuss them here. And here's another comment by Zelensky, I think in that same interview, where he's talking about the logic for NATO in Ukraine. Watch this.
If we are not in NATO, why is he on our soil? If we're not in NATO, and America says that we are not ready to take Ukraine to NATO, then Putin must fully retreat from our territory. That is logical.
That it's logical? I mean, what possible definition of logic can he have in there? But the thing that concerns me is that the look on his face, his body language, is he might believe that. It might not just be rhetorical flesh. He may believe that it's logical for Putin to just withdraw if he gets in NATO.
Well, again, what he is doing is he's scoring or trying to score rhetorical points as if this is some kind of a debate that's going on between him and Putin. He says, oh, we're not going to join NATO. So if we're not going to join NATO, you've got no reason to be in our territory. Well, the real world isn't like that. The Russians aren't going to withdraw. They're not going to give up all this territory that they've taken control of. They've passed constitutional amendments that say that they're part of Russian territory. They're under no pressure to retreat. Again, if you come along to the Russians and you talk in that way, they will conclude you're just not serious. You're not really there to discuss peace. You're not really there to discuss terms. You're simply somebody who's just wasting their time, and they might just as well continue advancing, which is, of course, what they are.
Well, and that's the concern, is that if we're looking at this from the Western perspective, and maybe what Trump's thinking about it, and the points that Zelensky's trying to score rhetorically, but you can't get away from how all those rhetorical points are being received on the Russian side, the side that has the troops on the ground, that has the missiles in the air, the planes, the air defense capabilities, et cetera, that the Ukraine side doesn't have. If they keep going down this path, then I think you're going to get to the point to where there's going to be this literal destruction of the Ukraine army, and then they won't have any leverage to negotiate anything.
Well, absolutely. I mean, even Ukraine's intelligence chief, Mr. Budanov, has allegedly said this, and he probably did say it because he was given an opportunity to deny it, and he didn't. He said this in a meeting, apparently. He said that they've got about 6 months left, and that after 6 months, very, very difficult consequences will follow. That's what he said, and that's the reality. So you don't want to get to that point. You don't want to get to that point of 6 months when things start to go badly wrong, what your own intelligence chief is saying, because of course at that point you have no leverage at all. You have no cards left to play in a negotiation at all. You need to start negotiating seriously now. Now, the Russians have set out their terms. As I said, they're not impossible. You don't have to accept them wholesale. You can argue certain points. I mean, NATO, not arguable. but maybe Russians might be prepared to be flexible on some territorial issues, about the size of the Ukrainian army, about those kind of things. I don't want to try and work out in advance what the negotiation would be. But I mean, the fact is, they are fighting, they are losing people. They don't want to do that, presumably. If you start negotiating in earnest, then something perhaps can be achieved now. If you wait 3 months, 6 months, then what you will probably find is that the Russians have moved further west. They're in a stronger position. They're advancing faster. The pressure on them to come to terms is less, and there is a real risk. And Lavrov has spoken about this in the past. There is a real risk that at that point, the Russians will toughen their terms. Can I just say a point that people have not noticed is that if we look outside the 4 oblasts, the 4 regions, which the Russians say are Russian territory, if we look at Kharkiv region, which so far the Russians accept it is Ukrainian territory, over the last couple of weeks, there's been a rather ominous change in language. Because previously the Russians would say, when they captured a village or a community in Kharkiv, that they have captured this community or that community or whatever. Now they're starting to say that they have liberated these places. Now, when they use that word, liberate, that suggests that they are already thinking about staying there. Now, it's not yet official policy, but you could see where the trend goes. So negotiate now, keep what you have, preserve Ukraine, keep the Russians as far from Kiev as possible, work something out, save your people. Those options are still there, but the time window is closing. And you talked about a slow death march. That's what Zelensky's language is, pulling Ukraine further along.
And I may be asking you to speculate a little bit here. I don't know if you have any sources within the Ukraine army per se, but I guess just kind of using your logic and common sense here, there is an assumption by many in the West that these things can drag on another 3 to 4 to 5, 6 months, et cetera, implying that the Ukrainian army will be able to continue to remain viable, and however many people they keep sending up there, and they'll still be fighting as tough as they do. But if you're the Ukraine army and you know that Trump is negotiating the end, he set 100 days as a target, there's this leaked information out there that it could be over by May, how eager are you going to be continue to sacrifice your life and take risks for something that is already determined is going to end?
Well, first of all, I don't have contacts in the Ukrainian army. I would like to, but I don't. But my own guess is that if Ukrainian soldiers, and they're very exhausted, they're very tired, if they feel that the war is going to end soon, then they're going to become even more grudging of their lives and of the sacrifices that they've been asked to make than they have been previously. And that is a really, actually excellent point, because one can see how negotiations in this situation might demoralize, conceivably, an already demoralized army even further, especially if you start setting these impossible targets like 100 days. So I that is basic psychology, but you're getting more and more reports that there's mass desertions, that Ukrainian units are refusing orders to attack. You see videos being posted by Ukrainian soldiers being very critical of their commanders. They did so recently in a place called Velikaya Novoselka, which the Russians captured. I suspect that if they feel that this thing is being dragged on for no useful purpose, but that a deal is going to be done anyway, then their further sacrifices are in vain. Yeah. Then you're going to find it more difficult to maintain discipline in an army which has fought very well. And I think that is a point that every outsider should acknowledge.
Yeah, and certainly we do. We absolutely, they have fought just heroically and brilliantly, but ultimately futilely, because I mean they're not going to have gained anything with this loss. And I think that again circles back to the guy at the top. that Zelensky has continued to send them into impossible situations. And I differ from a lot of Western military analysts who, say Zelensky has been, a great wartime commander. I think he's been hideous. I think he has made a number of major tactical blunders as commander in chief that have done nothing but cause more death and destruction among his troops and gained no possibility for any kind of rollback or to reversal of the situations, only just cause more death. And I think at some point that may be coming back to haunt him. But these issues here, so far we've been talking mainly about Zelensky and his ambassador, but unfortunately this lack of willingness to acknowledge reality also afflicts others in the West. You and I were talking before we came on the air here that Keir Starmer has been making some statements just earlier this week, implying that it's like the second, or maybe the first year of the war. Like we're going to give more in 2025 than we have before. You had Mark Rutte at NATO headquarters earlier this week say, yes, we're going to continue to provide everything that Ukraine needs so that it can solidify the front lines. And then, later on, they can get a good negotiating position, et cetera. And then just today, I think today or yesterday, we found out that there's going to be some French Mirage jets that are going to be given to Ukraine at this late date. They're going to say, let's give them some jets. They've received both French and Dutch fighters. They're these Mirages. And earlier today, I believe it was, Sean Bell went on to explain some of the he's in some sense, the clip I'm about to show you, at one point he actually said, this could be some real use for the Ukraine. But then he went into some details because he's a former fighter pilot himself, explained the challenges like this.
The problem with offering fighter jets is that even if we were to deliver 200 fighter jets, roughly the number that we believe President Zelensky needs, even if they were to arrive on the lawn outside the presidential palace in Kyiv tomorrow, they wouldn't have the pilots to fly them, they wouldn't have the engineers to service them and the like. And besides, how would they be used? Because Russia has a very sophisticated air defense system along the front line, and Ukraine, bluntly, doesn't have the layered defenses and the coordination to actually operate these jets in a wartime environment.
Okay, well, if you don't have the capacity and you're not going to, and it takes, elsewhere in that commentary, he talks, it's not months, it's years, plural, to be able to train a pilot to really be effective in combat operations, which they won't have, then why do you keep saying, this is what Zelensky thinks he needs, and then they give it to him? Why does the Dutch and the French governments give something that a rational an analyst would say will not make any difference?
Well, Daniel, you've just put your finger on one of the great enigmas of this war, because to me, your question has an obvious answer. You don't do it. I mean, it makes absolutely no sense to do this at all. You're just giving weapons and giving hope, by the way, with those weapons, giving hope to the Ukrainian people, which cannot be fulfilled. It's a deception. It's a cruel deception of your own public, because you're giving the appearance that you're doing something when you're not really doing anything. It's a cruel deception of Ukraine. It's a cruel deception of everybody. It is prolonging the war, and it is making the disaster worse. The only explanation I can give for this, and it's a really, really ugly explanation, is that I am sure that some of the people, the decision makers who are doing this, understand the points that Sean Bell was making there. And I've heard them before. And as a military person, I'm sure you understand them even better than I do. But they want to give these weapons because they still want the war to continue. It's not that they expect the weapons to be used in any particular way, but that certain Western governments are very heavily invested in the war, and they want to drag it on because they hope somehow that if they do drag it on, something will turn up, the Russian economy will collapse, or the Americans will decide that they want to get involved, or something will happen which will change events in their favor. That's the only rational explanation that I can come up with. It is a very, very ugly one because it's a deception. And I can say in advance that none of these things are going to happen. You're not going to see a collapse in Russia, and you're not going to see the Americans coming and fighting the war, even though there are some people I know in France, in Britain, and of course in Ukraine who would like it to happen.
And, you know, you can argue it is theoretically possible that some of those things could happen. You can't rule that out. It's human affairs. Sometimes that does happen. Sometimes there are governments collapse and things happen that could cause, you know, somebody to withdraw. That you can't rule that 100% out.
No.
But that is in contrast to the almost certainty that the opposite will happen that you just described, that the Ukraine army will continue its slow death march, that it will eventually be ground down to where it can no longer even maintain the continuity of as a force, and the Russians may at some point literally be able to just drive into Ukraine depth because the Ukraine army will collapse. That is a much higher probability than the theoretical hope that these other people seem to be banking on with Ukraine lives in the balance.
Well, absolutely. What they're doing is they're gambling against ever more difficult odds. I mean, by now, I mean, in 2022, maybe you could have said this to yourself. You could have said, well, you know, if you give a bit more here or put a few more sanctions there, this will change the dynamic of it. By this point in the war, anybody looking at the situation, obviously you're absolutely right. In human affairs, things can always take incredibly unexpected turns. There might be, you know, a sudden financial crisis in Russia. There's no sign of one, despite what you sometimes read, but maybe there will be. Maybe the Chinese government will suddenly decide that for their own reasons, they want to put pressure on the Russians to stop. But these are very unlikely eventualities, and you should not be gambling on lives when the chances that your gamble are likely to come off are so extremely low. On the contrary, if you continue piling on your chips in this kind of way, on, you know, playing this kind of, you're just going to increase your losses, your own losses, and of course Ukraine's.
And I cannot rationally come up with any more probability than that this will drag on, that Zelensky will continue to not be willing to make the kinds of concessions that you defined earlier, and that Putin is probably like, will shrug his shoulders. I think he would prefer to have a diplomatic outcome and not sacrifice any more Russian soldiers, but I think that he had values above individual lives of Russian soldiers, the security of his country long term as he sees it. And I think that he'll just keep rolling. I don't think there'll be any slow or pause or anything in their operations if they don't get what they want. And then that means that the likelihood, not guaranteed, but the likelihood is that they will eventually conquer all the way to the Dnieper River, if not more.
Well, indeed, we do actually have some cards to play in a negotiation if we play them now and we play them well. And that brings us back to Putin. Putin is not indifferent to the fact that there are Russians dying in Ukraine, nor is Russian public opinion. Obviously, the fact that those Russians are dying makes it more important for Russians politically that the underlying objective in the war is achieved. So, you know, there is that other factor. But still, obviously, they would prefer to see the war end. But the reason Putin and the Russians would prefer to see a diplomatic solution is because they want to stabilize the situation on their western borders. They want security there. And that means that they want a long-term relationship, even if not a friendly relationship, at least a stable relationship, first and foremost with the United States. If they think they can achieve that, if they're not asked to concede absurd things, then I think Putin, who is a very practical man, will go for a diplomatic solution. And I think Russian society would support him in this.
And do you think
that's our leverage? I mean, that's what we need to understand.
Right. Right. So the rational thoughts from the Russian side and how they do want that as long as you play that. Do you think, and maybe I'm asking you something beyond your concept of knowledge or whatever, but do you think that Trump understands those things?
I don't think he does. I'm afraid I don't think this has been explained to him clearly, because I don't get the sense that they've been listening and reading carefully enough to what the Russians are saying. The Russians have, by the way, what I've just said now, I'm not saying off the top of my head. Putin himself has said this, that the ultimate objective is security for Russia and for its western borders, so that Russia can focus on economic and social development without having to worry all the time that there's going to be another crisis on its western borders, or that Western or NATO troops will establish themselves there, or they'll set up missiles, all that kind of thing. So if Putin thinks he can achieve that through a negotiation, especially with the Americans, and it has to be with the Americans, by the way, then that is attractive to him. That is the leverage we have over the Russians. If we come along and say we're going to sanction you unless you stop now, well, they're just going to shrug their shoulders and say, bring it on. You've done it all the 3 years. We're not impressed. We're not scared. We're just going to continue going forward in exactly the way we've done.
Yeah, they certainly have understood what sanctions are like and what they need to do. So we'll see how that works out. Well, listen, I really appreciate you coming on today. As always, it's an absolute delight and pleasure to have you on the show. And we'll look forward to having you back on. And we'll definitely, as these things continue to develop, as meetings happen and then things come out of that, we'd love to have you back on to explain, what that means again.
It will be an absolutely joy and a delight, Daniel, and I look forward to it.
Thank you very much. And it's always a pleasure for us. Always a pleasure for us to be bringing this to you, because we are unintimidated and uncompromised to bring you the truth, no matter what it is, because you deserve to know the truth. Be sure and like and subscribe if you haven't already. And we will look forward to seeing you on the next episode of Daniel Davis Deep Dive.